Great. Well, hi everyone. I'm Ariel and I'm a product security engineer at Twilio segment. I'm very excited to moderate today's panel as I'm currently an IC and I've been looking into making the change to management. We have a great panel today with not only great representation in management and leadership, but also a range from recently moved and very experienced leaders across different security domains. We'll start off with introductions from each of our panelists and a fun question. What fictional leader do you most relate to? We'll start off with you, Julia.
Hi, I'm Iulia Knecht. I lead application security engineering at Netflix. I've actually done the IT to manager pendulum swing a couple of different times now, and both of those were pretty different situations. So I've collectively managed for 4 years, most recently for the last 6 months at Netflix. To your question of which fictional leader, my previous team told me Leslie Knope. So, enthusiasm, love waffles, and I think feminism well noted by my team.
Rachel, you want to go up next?
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Rachel. I'm the head of security engineering at Benchling. I have been in a management role for about 4 years now, and almost exclusively my time as a manager has been at smaller companies where I've actually been building security teams from the ground up. In terms of the fictional manager leadership role, in kind of classic manager fashion, I decided to actually delegate the answer to this question to my team, whose responses ranged anywhere from Ted Lasso and Dumbledore to Darth Vader and Thanos. So I don't know what that says about me, or maybe that's more about kind of the type of team that I actually have.
Sneha, what about you?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sneha. I work as senior manager leading InfoSec Ops at One Medical. I'm originally from Nepal, have been in the US for a decade now. And I've been in management for just about 2 years and really looking forward to the discussion today. As far as fictional character, I don't know if this fits into the perfect, manager or leadership title, but I watch Friends a lot. Like, I'm obsessed with Friends, and I relate to Monica a lot, mostly because she naturally, organically ends up leading things and is always the person in crisis being like, all right, hold on a second, here's our plan, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And having had a career in incident response as a background, I feel like that just comes naturally to me, even in my personal life. So I relate the most with her. And I'm also an OCD in organizing and cleaning, so maybe that's the other connection there.
Monica's definitely the leader of the group. We have one other speaker who I think is having trouble joining currently. I'll send a message out, but let's get started with our first question. What does a manager do? Rachel, do you mind taking this one?
Sure. So to be completely honest, when I was first moving into management, this was actually my number one question for my manager at the time, because I feel like it's often a little bit unclear as an IC. Since kind of looking upwards, it just seems like managers are sitting in meetings all day. What do they actually do, right? So let's unveil the curtain a little bit. 100%, it is a lot of meetings. Like, I will be honest with you. But at a high level, as a manager, your responsibility is to really set direction for your team and ensure that they're executing against company goals and initiatives. So while it may not always be immediately visible, as it is for like an IC who's building something tangible, managers are doing stuff too. So a typical day for me could be spent anywhere from, having one-on-ones and career discussions with any individual on my team, to lots and lots of recruiting and interviewing, to, meeting with leaders across the org to build a relationship with them, to make sure that, in a case where we actually need them to do something in kind of a security regard, that actually have an established relationship with them to make it a little bit easier. And then really the big stuff is getting involved in company strategic initiatives to help make sure that security has a seat at the table and figure out, how do we get other teams to engage with our kind of security team to be able to effectively kind of support some of the projects and initiatives that they're working on. So, it is a lot of meetings. It's a lot of kind of working with other folks to get alignment across the organization. But, I think being a manager, it just really gives you exposure to a lot more of what's going on within the organization. It's a different kind of role.
Great. Next question is, what made you want to become a manager? Sneha, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a list of here's 5 things or here's 2 things, but for me personally, in my experience, I really enjoy working with people and solving problems that are beyond just the dependence on technology. So, whether it's working with several people within a team, different teams, cross-functionally, influencing, I find that really fascinating because there's really no formula. It's not like a code you can fix, or it's not a script you can push to production, right? It really takes a lot of strategic thinking, a lot of not being emotional about things, a lot of really objectively thinking about things. And as I mentioned earlier, I did have a background in incident response. So crisis management was something I extremely enjoyed, coming into chaotic situations and handling things to the best of my ability. And so when that opportunity came for managing a team as we were building a new program, that just kind of naturally happened for me. So I don't know if there was like a list of 5 things that made me want to become. It's just what I enjoyed and what I thought I would be good at. And it's always good to know that, if it doesn't work out, you can come back, right? There's no set rule that you have to be in management. So it was like a natural progression for me.
I hear that a lot where an opportunity comes, it has to kind of be the right time. So when would be the right time to become a manager? Is there a signal? Julia?
Yeah, great question. So I don't think that there's necessarily a right time kind of in a prescriptive way for everyone. I think management definitely isn't like a foregone conclusion as the only way to achieve new heights in your career. Staying hands-on, technical, or pursuing different types of roles might be more right for some people. So I think it's pretty deeply individual. And like Sneha said, like it's what you enjoy, it's what you want to be doing with your time. You might start getting feedback when you're working with people in your IC role around you'd make a great manager. And it's really important to consider those things, but also make sure that you know what you personally want to do. And I also think like do your time as a technical IC as well. Even if you think you want to get into management, I think establishing that deep technical background helps you to understand the challenges that your team is facing and their day-to-day, so you can really help them. Even if you don't directly manage the same team that you IC'd on, I think having those experiences really helps you to know how to manage folks in those situations. In my situation, the first time I became a manager, I was building out the AppSec function, and it really just needed to kind of expand and scale really quickly. And so since I was leading the effort, it was kind of just like, all right, ready, set, go, congratulations, you're managing, please like build this team and ready, like make it so. And so it really was kind of like thrust on me at that point, which I think can happen and probably happens pretty frequently as well. And then the more recent time I did this role change, I was much more intentional about it. I was pursuing it and I said, like, I want to go from IC to management. I had my really good reasons for it and saw the right opportunity. And so I think it was around wanting to build a team, mentor folks, help people unlock their potential, and set a strategic organizational vision. So I would definitely encourage just being really intentional around that decision making. There's not like any one signal, but just kind of knowing yourself and what you want and how that aligns with open opportunities.
Did you have similar sentiments, Sneha?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, right? There was no one sort of aha moment or, that was like defining for me. So very similar to what Julia said. And I'm actually very intrigued by Julia's point around coming back and forth. When I started management, I was like, oh, I don't know. How do people do that? And I've seen people do that so successfully. And I think there's a notion that you can only do that if you fail at something. That's not true. I know friends who enjoy switching multiple times because it keeps you relevant as well. That's something that's really fascinating to me, and I hope I could someday do that as well.
Great. So our fourth panelists have joined. Iulia, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe a fictional character that you relate to in terms of a leadership role?
Hey everyone, thanks Ariel so much for the introduction. It's great to be here with all of you. My name is Iulia. I am an engineering manager at Google. I originally come from Romania and I've been at Google for almost 9 years now. It's actually the only company I work for. Before that, I did my PhD at usability and at TTH Zurich in usability and security. And I've only started being a manager at Google like almost a year ago. Fictional character, I actually do not know. I don't have a good one, but I do always look at real characters, at people that I know and people that I meet, and I find a lot of role models and people that I admire and that I want to follow.
Great. So I've got a question for you, Iulia. When managing a team, there are different ways you can create a team. You can build one or inherit one. Could you tell us about how you created your team?
So for me, it was quite an interesting experience because before becoming a manager, I was a technical lead in a different team. And there I had a very good grasp of what the team is doing. I knew every line of code. I laid the foundation of the infrastructure. And it sort of felt like everything is a puzzle in my mind where I know all the code, I know all the people, I know what they can do. And I left all that and I went to a brand new team that already existed, that had been formed a long time ago, that hadn't had any churn. And it was such a different area from what I was working on because this new team was doing low-level Linux kernel development and operating systems. So I found myself no longer being the expert and being pushed from where I was the technical lead and the person who knew everything to just having to find my tools as a manager and figuring out how do I bring value to this team when I no longer understand everything and I have to delegate and I have to rely on people to, guide me with the technical decisions and to provide feedback there. And it was quite intimidating in the beginning, but actually going through that and then getting to a place where I felt like I see I can bring value. I see how I can still help everyone, and I can coach people, even though I'm not the technical expert anymore, and I can let go of that. That has been a very rewarding moment for me. And I did have a lot of churn in the team as well. As you know, the great resignation is happening right now, and a lot of people are looking for new opportunities and are feeling very bold to go into the unknown. And so in a way, I had an opportunity to also rebuild my team and to hire new people and to rethink the team culture and how do I influence that? How do I build a new team with an improved team culture or with the type of things that I wanted to see?
Great. On the other side, we've got Rachel. Could you tell us about your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the, arguably luxurious experience of really just getting to build a team from scratch. So I didn't necessarily have to inherit kind of anything, kind of any pre-existing problems within the organization, kind of cultural kind of changes there that I needed to work through. I had to kind of set the stage for all of that from the very beginning. And, I think it definitely poses its own challenge where, especially for me, like as a first-time manager, when I was first starting to build out the team, I had to make a lot of decisions around like, what is that first hire that I actually want as a part of my team, my application security program at the time. And so trying to figure out kind of the right kind of fit to kind of bring onto that organization and what does really kind of hiring look like for this new group was definitely something I had to create from the very beginning. So when you're kind of building kind of a team from scratch, and definitely I can say my experience at, doing this largely at a startup that didn't have a security program, you kind of have to do everything. So I was, building out interview loops, kind of building a career matrix for, what do human levels look like for different security engineers on my team. I had to define that internal team culture. What does our day-to-day process even look like? Do we do sprints? Do we do kind of weekly check-ins, daily stand-ups? All of that I actually had to build up from the very beginning, which is definitely, I think, a challenge to kind of make a lot of these what seem like really large decisions pretty early on, so that you're kind of setting the stage for each new person that you're bringing onto the group. And the other kind of note around kind of building a team is that, it actually, to me, made it seem like progress was a lot slower. So, I was actually forced to kind of take on some of the IC work in the short term, just to continue to keep the company progressing, where, I over time was able to kind of hand that off into new folks that we were able to bring on. And so it feels like you're not doing as much manager stuff sometimes in the beginning. That is just sort of like a different type of experience than kind of having a group that's already executing that you can just continue to kind of lead forward. So it's definitely challenging, but I think for me, like there's a lot of rewards in being able to essentially have the experience of handpicking every single person on my team and really getting to see their journey from that very first, sometimes very awkward phone screen that I had with them, to then, years later, helping them through promotions and kind of seeing them work together as a group is definitely a really exciting experience to be a part of.
So we're getting a couple of questions about the transition from IC to manager. We'll go more into specifics at the end of the section, but what are some specific challenges you've faced? Julia, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I've got a couple. I think the one thing is navigating changing relationships. So especially if you go from on the team to leading the team, you go from being a peer with people to leading them, holding them accountable, setting their goals, understanding a lot more about them. It really does change that relationship with people, and it takes a different shape and a different tone. And I think that can be difficult to navigate. I think what I've found there is lean into a little bit of vulnerability and help them to understand that you're changing your role and you're going to do your best to manage them, and then work to kind of reestablish those relationships and understand how they need to change to be able to kind of effectively manage folks. And I think the other thing that's always going to be a challenge, especially for first-time managers, as they go from IC to tech lead to team manager, is going to be taking your hands off of things and letting stuff go. I see this with almost everyone I talk to who's working through that transition for the first time. I saw it with myself, especially in my initial transition from IC to manager, was you may have built something that's really great and you put a lot of time into it, and then someone else has to take it over and run it. And you might be like, that's my baby. I made that thing and I knew what I was doing when I was doing that. And now you're doing something that's very different than what I think that I might do. And so understanding that management is a fully different role and you need to take your hands off of things and let them go to be truly effective. I think the thing that helped me come to this realization is that your time is so much better spent making your team more effective than actually, even if you are more effective at the IC work as well. It makes you less effective as a manager if you continue to do IC work. So I guess the way I logically think about it is if you have 5 people on your team and you can help coach them to be, 10, 20, 30% better at their job instead of going and spending that same amount of time implementing a technical solution, you're actually going to be leaps and bounds more effective than you would be putting your time into that work. And so I think it's definitely a little bit of a journey, and you will find yourself doing these things. And so I think it's just kind of being aware when you are holding on to something and not letting it go and letting someone else take that responsibility. But I think those are kind of 2 of the major challenges that stick out to me, and especially kind of first-time management transitions.
So that's really interesting, Julia. I've also had the experience where I missed technical work when switching into a manager role, and I miss just being the one in the driving seat that pushes everything forward, and instead it felt like just had to coach people and let it go and let the other people make progress. And this actually reminds me of something that one of my mentors told me. He said that he recommends, if you switch to a management role, to go to a completely new team in a new area, because that forces you to let go of those technical details of the technical work and to actually figure out what does a manager do and make yourself useful there. And for me, at times, so that's what happened to me, because I went to a new team. And at times that became really frustrating, because I had gone from a place of understanding what type of projects there can be and making them up and so on, to a place where I had to go and ask my technical lead, hey, how difficult is this project? This person do it, and get a lot of that feedback. And I felt it's very frustrating. And that's when I had a conversation with another mentor of mine, and she said to me, welcome to management. At that point, I understood that it's not just me. It's not just because I'm in an area where I don't have the expertise and the background. And I think that really helped me feel reassured that it's normal and sort of not run away how I was feeling I wanted to do in the moment.
Yeah, and I can jump in here too. Very similar challenges, and I know there was a question in the chat around coming from a security analyst background. That was actually me. My first job in security as an intern was that, and that's a very tactical job. It's very deep dive into logs and very opposite from what can be a strategic manager role. So when I became a manager first, it was extremely difficult to let go. To Julia's point, and it took me a couple of months, I have to say, to realize, okay, this is not going to scale. If I keep doing this, I'm not being able to efficiently manage a team. So that was my first goal. I told myself that slowly start to let go. I didn't want to do it overnight because that's a state of disruption. The team would panic. So I strategically planned what are some things I'm going to fully delegate from start to finish. I made owners from the team for certain team processes. And while there were lots of challenges, right now looking back 2 years in this role, it's so rewarding to see that where we started the team as, when I see a junior engineer now being able to drive critical projects or incidents and has come such a long way, even in public speaking, giving presentations. I have team members in my team presenting at conferences. So all those things together, it makes it so rewarding. It's not that one thing, that one project necessarily. It's a combination of these little things that I think as a manager, you definitely note because you know where you had started. So I think it is challenging, but there are lots of rewards to it. So if you're considering that, I know in the chat we're getting lots of thoughts around that. It is totally possible, whether you are super technical and want to be tactical, and it takes you a little time to kind of step back, but it is very possible.
When reflecting back about your experience as a manager, how has your perspective changed about your past managers after becoming a manager? Sneha, do you want to take this one again?
Yeah, sure. This is something I talk about all the time. I think I've told all of you too, and even my past manager, I used to joke with him after I became a manager that I want to hug all of my past managers because my perspective, my understanding of their role now has changed night and day. So when I was not a manager and an IC, to Rachel's earlier point, we were talking about meetings, right? And I used to think the same, that what does my manager do? He's in meetings all day. When does he get work done? Or does he even get work done? And now, having been a manager for 2 years, yes, you're in meetings, but you're solving such complex problems. The scope of your problems are so diverse. A typical day could look like, you're dealing with a crisis in your team, projects are falling apart, and today you just got told from your leadership that a board presentation is due in 2 days. Your 2 team members in your team can't get along. Somebody just had a personal emergency. I'm not saying all of this happens necessarily at the same time, but the breadth of problems that someone could be dealing with. And then the worst, when you have a top performer and you go to them and you have to tell them the news that you can't get them a raise because of budget issues. So those were the kind of things my managers were dealing with. And here I was trying to go with the silly thing, which wasn't silly then. Now looking back, it was so small and silly, right? So that is one thing that has definitely changed for me, understanding their scope. The other one was around poor performance. I used to always wonder why my manager can't manage poor performance easily. Why does it take so long? Why doesn't he share these details with me? And having gone through a similar situation, I didn't realize how much amount of process and paperwork and HR processes you have to follow that not only take time, but so much of your energy that it's very draining. And what makes it worse is you can't talk about it. These are very confidential things that you have to only keep it within a very limited HR group. So to your team, they may be thinking like, what are you doing about it? You're probably doing nothing. But in the back end, there's just so much effort you're putting to solve that problem. So those are a couple of areas where my perspective has significantly changed.
Very interesting. Rachel, what are some mistakes that you have made as a manager?
I think one of the first and probably hardest things that I had to learn is that, frankly, that people just can't read my mind, or that they don't necessarily think about problems in the same way that I do. And so for those that have actually seen Silicon Valley, there's actually a nice kind of reference to this in the show where, the CEO is this figure, his name's Gavin Belton, and they're kind of prepping for kind of this big conference that the company is hosting. And so he makes this offhand comment in the context of prepping for the conference around the bear is sticky with honey. And so he just says this offhand to his team and kind of walks off. And they all turn to him and they're extremely confused of like what they're supposed to do with this information. And they start spending an extraordinary amount of time thinking that this is some indicator that the entire conference like needs to be rethemed. They spend all of this work kind of retooling presentations so that is somehow themed around bears. And a couple weeks later, he comes back and he looks at them. He's like, "What are you guys doing? Like, I literally meant this honey bear that was being used for tea has honey all over it, and it just needs to be cleaned." And so while I think that's kind of a silly reference, the reality is I think what I never realized as a manager was that some of the things that I say to team members or the way that I kind of explain things isn't universally understood. And so having kind of gone through that experience with some folks before, which frankly was frustrating on both sides, I made assumptions that they understood what I was talking about. And then they took kind of my word and took it in a very different direction. And the two of us were frankly irritated that, you know, neither of us were kind of like on the same page and understanding what was going on. It was a hard lesson for me to really kind of take a step back, especially, you know, in the early stages of working on projects and initiatives, just to make sure that we had alignment across like what were we actually trying to accomplish and what is actually the goal of the work that we're doing, and keeping kind of a pulse on that on a regular cadence, not from like a micromanaging standpoint, but just to make sure that things are being kept on track and that there's no kind of misunderstanding between folks that are involved on the project. It was definitely hard for me to kind of learn that. And it is something that, you know, I would freely admit it is still a struggle to just make sure that things are kind of clear for when it's important, and kind of helping to kind of make sure that things are kind of continuing to stay along kind of the track that they need to for the company to be successful.
Speaking of clarity, as an IC, compensation is a little bit of a black box. Could you share some more information about how compensation is handled, the conversations that happen behind the doors between ICs and managers, and how decisions are made? Julia, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, great question. I think as an IC, this was definitely a kind of black box, didn't understand how decisions were made. In my first role as a manager, I was on the other side of that table and had people coming to me, my reports saying like, "Hey, I would like a raise, let me talk about comp." And they were actually a lot more direct than I had been as an IC. And so I feel like that was one thing that I learned as a manager is like, oh, wow, these conversations can be very direct and straightforward. And so I think that also as a manager, realizing that that helped me to understand their goals and what they were looking for, so we could have really kind of transparent conversations with each other. And so there's a whole swath of ways that comp is done. I think the most common one is based on career leveling. So for example, like engineer level 2, 3, 4, etc. And then the titles are kind of based or earned based on projects worked, impact shown. And then they usually will have like pay bands associated with them at a company level. They're usually something that's not set by managers, but set by HR. But the manager's job is to understand and determine kind of like, where does your team sit? Where do the individuals on your team sit in terms of like that leveling? And then within the band itself, like how senior and how much impact are they showing, and then kind of arriving at that number. And I would say that's probably the most common approach in tech companies and probably a lot of different businesses. And then I think that one thing that's important there for both ICs and managers is making sure that those expectations are really clear. I find that at some companies, they're really well defined, and they say you should have this kind of impact and this kind of projects and this kind of consistency to be a level 2, 3, 4, 5. And then there are some places that I've been that it's a little bit less defined. And so as a manager, it's your job to really define that. And that might be taking some time to write down a leveling guide and make sure that your employees understand, right? Because it shouldn't feel like a black box to ICs, in my opinion. It should feel like I know how I'm performing and what my manager expects of me so that I can reach that next level. The clarity of that communication is really important. And so if I'm at a company without those well-defined expectations, I'll make sure to set those and work on writing them down. So I would say that's pretty standard. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's also companies that have a little bit less structure, and then comp is kind of determined by the market and impact, and there's less leveling. There are companies who like to be a a little bit flatter. There's not a whole bunch of different titles or levels. And so then it also comes back to like setting expectations, and that could be directly with your manager and your team, or your team and you. And so that's kind of the approach that I take. And what I usually tell ICs is make it easy for your manager to understand the work that you're doing so that they can appropriately level you, right? And then as a manager, make sure that you are kind of coming into that conversation as well, seeking to understand all of the impact and the goals of your individual contributors, right? Because if there's maybe a gap in terms of what that IC expects and what you are seeing, that needs to be communicated, because otherwise, I think, to Rachel's point, like if communication's just not happening really clearly, then everyone's kind of disappointed and a little bit put out by it. So yeah, I would say definitely compensation is something to talk about, be straightforward about it. And then as a manager, kind of being really transparent is my approach there to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
A little more on this topic. Could each of you tell us how the compensation differed from IC to manager? And we can start with Iulia.
So for me, actually, I did not get any pay bump when I became a manager. If you are looking to move into a management role to get that extra money, it's not going to happen, at least not at Google. I think, so at Google, where I work, the pay bumps also go according to like how has your performance been, when do you apply for a promotion, like what's the next level. And there is parity, where they're trying to keep parity between the manager ladder and the individual contributor ladder. So individual contributor work and like deep technical expertise also gets very rewarded. So in my case, there hasn't been a change there. For me, it was more the opportunity to grow a different set of skills and to get a type of experience that I had not had. And also it aligned very well with my personal interests, because I had found myself like be more and more curious about what do great managers do to make such a big difference between somebody's like not enjoying their job and somebody being very effective and being very happy at it. So no pay bump there, but if you enjoy the role and if you are doing really well at it, I think you can grow your career, and that's when the financial reward is going to come.
Julia, what about you?
Thanks. Yeah, I've actually experienced both. I've gotten a comp change when a role change happened, and then I've gotten comp changes later on down the line when I've showed impact. One thing I want to call out is I've seen kind of a trend in especially tech, but there's kind of a pattern of a decrease in the disparity. I think like years and years ago, as a manager, you might make a lot more money than every individual on your team. But I've seen an increase in companies realizing that there's a ton of value in these very high level ICs, and pushing them into management positions is not the right thing for the company or for that person. And so I've seen kind of these parallel ladders emerge where there's an IC track and a manager track, and compensation can be pretty equitable across those things at the different levels. One thing that I might say is kind of a difference is I have seen in manager roles, there might be a little bit more of a leaning towards kind of the total comp number being more influenced by equity than by like your cash compensation or salary.
Yeah, I'll say in my experience, I definitely kind of saw that kind of mixture of kind of comp being a different structure, especially when you look at the higher levels. And this is obviously like organizationally specific, but oftentimes folks that are kind of at a director level or higher on the management track, you will see kind of compensation be almost purely kind of based on their ability to execute against company initiatives. And so what I saw from a personal experience is that I was required to essentially set forth kind of goals for the year that were kind of aligned with kind of other things that are going on within the organization. And my ability to get a raise or a bonus was 100% dependent by me or my team actually meeting those goals. If we didn't meet that, I got no compensation change, no kind of cost of living adjustment. If we were able to actually execute against that, then it actually included kind of options or different stock that would be kind of a part of any kind of raise and adjustments there. So there are different levers, essentially, as you kind of move into management, that I've seen get flexed that can be a little bit different from just purely kind of the cash story that I think a lot of people think about when they look at comp. But similar experience to some of the others. My initial kind of move into management, there was zero comp changes. It was just a lateral movement for me as well.
Yeah, and in my experience, it was sort of similar, a little different. So I did get a raise actually when I became a manager, but I do want to believe that if I had even moved into a ladder in the IC side of the world, like a staff engineer, that route, I believe it would still happen. So I don't think that the title is necessarily what gives you the raise. To the points made here, I think whether you're in the management route or the IC route, the scope of your work, the responsibilities you're driving, the impact you're creating, and a little bit of your negotiation skills as well. I think that kind of forms whether you get a comp update or not. The other thing I've seen recently in a lot of tech companies, in my experience, is the salaries are starting to be very comparable, right? We are seeing senior manager salaries very similar to now, say, a staff engineer, a principal engineer, we're seeing to director. And in some cases, we also see teams where, let's say we have a smaller team that's doing great work, but not at the level of impact or scope that another team is doing. So you could have a senior manager in that team making a little less than maybe a senior engineer in a different team that is driving critical business projects. So I think it comes down to impact and your part in driving key things, like Rachel said. And yes, I do always encourage advocating for yourself too. Sometimes don't wait for the salary update to come. I was one of those who was not comfortable asking for a raise, but recently through the help of my mentors, I have been able to do that by showing, okay, here's the things I'm doing, here's the impact, I do need an adjustment. So I like to call it an adjustment for the work you are taking more and more.
Thank you all for sharing. Well, Dave Security is about changing the status quo and advocating for more women in security. And I think it's really important to call out the opportunity to hear from industry leaders who are underrepresented and the unique problems that they face. Rachel, could you talk to us about some challenges you faced as a female manager?
Sure. So first, I'll just say that I've been extremely fortunate to have been part of organizations and teams that have been generally supportive of my own career goals or just generally having kind of diversity within leadership. But some of the more frustrating experiences that I have had as a female manager was honestly hands down with recruiting. So whether it's because of my perceived gender or just something about my personality, I actually have had the unpleasant experience of candidates pretty regularly making inappropriate comments to me in the context of an interview. The most common example was for a period of about a year, at least 50% of all of the phone screens that I made, and I'm actually not exaggerating, it is about 50% of them, candidates would make comments like, wow, you're so technical for a recruiter, or how do you even understand like what I'm talking about? You're just in HR. And admittedly, in the moment, it was honestly pretty frustrating to hear that over and over and over again, since it would take like 2 seconds to just look who you're going to be talking to in an interview. And honestly, I've had the pleasure of working with some extremely technical recruiters that honestly would have just been really insulted by comments like that. So in the moment, essentially, like I had to kind of swallow my feelings a bit. I politely corrected them and would finish the interview as fast as possible. And then because I'm in a position of power to do something about it, I honestly rejected them from our interview process. For me and for the type of team that I'm interested in building, we value folks from all different types of backgrounds, technical or not. And offhand comments like that are not super in line with the type of culture that I'm trying to build. So it's sad to say that like in 2021 that I'm actually like desensitized to that now to a certain extent, but I also view it as a blessing that, I didn't necessarily have to waste the rest of my team's time interviewing somebody that wouldn't be a good fit for our organization. And it really enabled me to focus in on the type of culture that we're trying to build within our team and kind of foster that. So it's definitely a challenge that I have faced, but it's something that I've learned to kind of work through and kind of turn it into a positive.
Yeah, I've definitely had some of those recruiting experiences as well. I also want to add that in my experience, and this might not be so unique to management, but one of the things that I've noted is sometimes getting straightforward and actionable feedback is a little bit difficult. There's been some research done that shows that women are less likely to get super actionable feedback and more likely to get less actionable feedback. Things like, good job, you're doing great, right? That doesn't necessarily help me grow. That talks to something I've already done, not something I can do in the future. And so I've had experiences where like I'll be talking to someone senior in an organization, who can influence things, kind of opportunities that I'm exposed to, who will do things like good job, or kind of call out my contributions in like a tokenizing way and say like, oh, Julia, a woman on the team did this, right? And it's really frustrating to feel like you're only kind of called out in that tokenized way. And so I would say that the way that I approached that was to make sure that my kind of direct manager and levels up in my chain understood the value that I bring, and make sure that they also have my back in calling out that kind of behavior, to make sure that it's not kind of a diminutive comments are able to stack up against me in my career as well. So I think that's something to probably look out for, and just make sure you've got a really good support system.
Yeah, and I can jump in here. I totally relate to what Julia and Rachel said. It's so unfortunate that here we are still trying to talk about this, but I think it's important to talk about these issues and not just brush them, right? I think, yes, we've made a lot of progress since where we were as a tech industry, not just a security industry, but these things still happen. And I can share one experience. I was actually on the other end. I was interviewing for a role, and I was talking to a leader, and I thought the interview went great. And at the end, again, with the best intention, this person said, just so you know, or remember, we're not going to hire you because you're brown and a woman, or something comment like that. And I just felt so gross after that. Like I just remember leaving that interview feeling like, no, I can't even think why is that comment necessary? I think the whole thing about why we're doing conferences like these and we talk about this is to encourage people, to remind them that gender should not matter. Skin color, gender, whatever it is, should not matter. And look at us for our skills, our performances, what we bring to the table. Judge us on that. We will take the criticism, right? But when you get offhand comments like these, I think it just, at least to me personally, it just almost like made my spirits like really, I felt really down that day. And I was like, wow, I thought they would end with something about how, some of the discussion we had in the interview or something like that, but it ended up with a comment about how I looked. So I think this is still a problem. I do think there are a lot of companies and people coming forward to talk about this, do little things to help improve this problem. And I don't think this is something that will be fixed overnight. And it really takes that little thing. I know it sounds cheesy, but like even mentoring someone, one person helping someone, doesn't have to be a female or male or whatever, should not matter. Lifting someone's confidence, helping them not only to enter the security industry, but to thrive in the industry as well. I've been very lucky. Like I have had a lot of mentors, even male mentors in my career that are hugely responsible for my success today. So I think we could try our best to continue to solve this problem through mentorship, through conferences like these. There's a lot of boot camps, apprenticeship programs that are targeting sourcing from diverse recruiting platforms. And I think the biggest thing, if I can say on this topic, is I think there's a misconception. People think that we want to be looked as because we're a woman, give us the job. That's not the case. In fact, we're saying it shouldn't matter, right? And that's the battle I think I'm seeing a lot of companies fight. So I think we'll make progress, and we'll continue to make progress.
I unfortunately also have heard the narrative, oh, look, she's a director, she's not that great at this thing. She probably got there because she's a woman. And every time I hear that, I'm like, how about that guy and that guy and that guy who are also like not so great at speaking, and like they're in those positions. But somehow, like, if you're a woman, then like everybody assumes that the gender is important. And I'm like, it's frustrating to hear that. But I find it effective in those moments to point out to people like other examples of like other leaders that and say like, well, if that person was a woman, how would you perceive this? Like, would you say that they got there for because of the gender? Because you're not saying it for men.
Well, thank you all for sharing your stories and giving just really good feedback for how we can continue to grow. As our final question, what is your biggest takeaway as a manager? Start with Sneha.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can jump in. This takeaway is more for managers. We've talked a lot about, of course, ICs and their perspective, but I would say to all the managers who are today managing teams, it's very easy to get into your thoughts and think you could have done something extremely better. Yes, there are situations where maybe you learn from it and you could improve, but also know that there are situations where you could not have done anything more. Sometimes things are out of your control. Let things fail. It's okay to fail sometimes and learn from it. So cut yourself some slack is what I would say. You're doing great, and don't be so hard on yourself. For managers, that's my message.
Iulia, did you want to add to that? I think you're muted.
Of course. I totally agree with that. I've been in those situations as well, and I found it very helpful when somebody more experienced in the management ladder told me like, hey, you're in a tough situation, like there is this thing that you could work on and this, and just recognize that you cannot boil the ocean and that there's only so much that you could do as a manager, and that's okay. Another big takeaway for me was how success changes and like changes in terms of like what's expected of you. And a bit, again, coming back to the discussion of letting go, I think that has been an eye-opening experience for me, because previously I was very used to having that immediate feedback on my code is working. I did this, I finished this. And it felt so good to be in control and to be the one that's driving progress and that's doing things. And one of the most valuable discussions that I had with my manager was when I asked for feedback on what am I doing, what should I be doing differently. And I got an answer that I did not expect. And he told me, you're spending so much time on execution. You need to free up some of that time and like just let it go and let people in your team drive things and drive the execution, and make the time for yourself to think strategically and think about what's next and what should the team be doing. And I think as a manager, you see the results much slower. In a way, it does feel like time is, I don't know, that everything is moving very slow. And the rewards then come maybe some months later when you see that my coaching really did make a difference. And look, this person is really owning this area now. And I don't have to step in and to drive things and to make things happen. So for me, that was a big takeaway and an eye-opening moment when I realized like, yep, I need to let go of the things that I was doing and to make time for myself to think ahead of the team and to focus on the strategic part.
I think for me, like one of my biggest takeaways is just if you're considering kind of move into management, just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. I have zero regrets about my transition into this role, but I've heard some comments from peers about particularly women kind of being pushed towards management positions because we're viewed as kind of stereotypically collaborative or supportive. And there is absolutely nothing like wrong with just continuing to be a technical rock star for the rest of your career. Like there is a track for you. And frankly, if your organization doesn't support that, it's probably a consideration to go look somewhere else. So don't feel like you have to move into management if that's not something that you're interested in. There's definitely kind of opportunities to continue to stay on an IC or just purely a technical track as well.
And I will say that my biggest goal as a manager is try to leave as many conversations with my team members, pulling myself out of the middle of things, and coaching and empowering them to solve problems independently, make decisions independently as well, and be there maybe for them to bounce those ideas off of, but avoid telling them what the right answer is, right? The experience of coming to that conclusion themselves empowers them to do those things independently so that you can really spend time scaling yourself and your team, help them grow that confidence in their abilities, so that the team can kind of continue into broader and higher impact work.
Great. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to our amazing panelists for leading a great discussion. Before we move on to just one question, most likely, everyone's hiring, so please feel free to reach out to these panelists over LinkedIn and check out the jobs available at these links. So please screenshot this slide. We have one question. Is it possible to move to the management side of cybersecurity without a technical background in cybersecurity? Does one of our panelists want to take this?
I can jump in, and if anybody wants to add along, yeah, absolutely. It is totally possible, even if you don't have a technical background. Cybersecurity has so many fields. Let's pause the management for a bit, right? Just think of the breadth of things it has, whether it's technical routes, whether it's program management, policies and procedures. There's just so many topics and functions within security as a whole. So whether you want to be a manager or an IC, I think it's totally possible. So I would ask yourself, what is it that you enjoy? First, to Rachel's point, is this something you really want to do? You're interested as far as management goes? And then within security, what are some areas that you're passionate about? And I actually worked with someone recently who became a manager, and they don't necessarily lead a technical program. They lead our program management team and drive our projects, and they're a rock star and they're great at managing. So I would say it's totally possible. Just find what is it that you enjoy doing. Anyone else want to jump in that?
Yeah, I actually want to add that, sorry. I was going to say, I want to add that I've seen this dichotomy between technical and non-technical, and I want to question that a little bit, because I think that some things that people describe as non-technical, or when they mean just pure engineering or the ability to hack something or something like that, right? They might be referring to that as technical, but those other disciplines of cybersecurity are technical in that they are a discipline, right? Just because something is GRC or program management does not mean that you're not growing like very technical hard skills in that area. And so I think I always get a little bit, I guess the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I hear like, oh, you're non-technical, right? Just because maybe you're not an engineer or you don't code, right? And I think that that's kind of a thing that holds us back as an industry, is not recognizing those as really important and actually technical and skills that grow in a discipline as well.
Yeah, the only other thing that I was going to add is I think it's very much like organizationally dependent. So I actually was in a kind of an interesting position where I had the ability to interview incoming CISOs for an organization that I was at. And it was kind of interesting to see the variety of kind of the backgrounds. You know, there were definitely kind of CISOs and kind of leaders that, you know, were former software engineers and had kind of like hardcore engineering skills, to folks that came from a compliance background and knew kind of industry regulations, you know, like the back of their hand, and how to kind of execute against that, towards folks that were somewhere in the middle where they could do a little bit of everything, but they kind of, you know, understood when to kind of lean in and lean out. And so I think it just depends very much on, you know, what is kind of the right set of skills for the organization. Like, when do you need to kind of augment as a manager on the technical side, because maybe you don't necessarily kind of have that within your team, or when can you rely on the team that exists and then focus more on just kind of the higher level kind of vision. It just depends is kind of the answer. And I would kind of encourage folks that are considering kind of the jump to kind of look at the organizations that they are considering kind of that move into, to see like what actually kind of fits for what they need.
Yeah, one last point I'll add to that is just, Julia, you made me think of something. You know, sometimes people say technical skills and soft skills. I hate that word, soft skills. Like, these are such important skills, how you communicate. You could be the most technical for the word in that domain, and if you don't know how to communicate, work with people, collaborate, and really drive things. And so I almost, to Julia's point, challenge you to, whoever is saying that you're not technical, ask them, what about where are you not technical? Because I actually get that a lot. In fact, got that early in my career, because for me, I was technical in my IR domain, but maybe not technical in other things. But that doesn't mean I'm not technical. To Julia's point, in my discipline, I know what I'm doing. So as long as, you know, you find something you're passionate about, I would challenge that notion of you're not technical.
For me, one thing that was surprising when I switched to a manager role was how much of being a good manager, being great, and as you advance more in your career towards leadership position, how much those what they call soft skills are important. And the crazy thing for me was that nowhere in my years of experience, nowhere in my school, in my courses, were those things taught. So up to that moment, in my school, like I learned how to code, how to do this, how to all those technical things. There was no course about how to resolve conflicts, how to make people feel well and understood, and to show empathy. And then up to that point, every success metric that was being used felt like was much more focused on number of lines of code. Have you solved the problem? Have you launched the feature? And all of a sudden, and I think now going forward as well, going towards leadership positions, those what they call soft skills were just paramount, were just so important to resolving conflicts, to moving teams along, to creating the culture. So I would say do not underestimate those and start working on those and like creating opportunities to learn in those areas as early as you can. And on the flip side, with technical skills, I feel that sometimes, especially to women, those are said in a negative way, as in like, well, you're not technical enough. You should work more on your technical skills. And part of me, like, I always revolt when I hear that. I'm like, no, like not necessarily. So do not feel intimidated if people tell you, oh, you don't have enough technical skills. Or if they just make like, oh, the soft skills are something completely separate and they're separate from like your technical skills. It all works together and they are both very important. And take the risk and do not let people tell you that you're not good enough.
I see a question on the screen asking for advice for women who are fearful because they aren't technical, but they want to be. And I would say if you want to be technical, pursue that. Definitely don't think that just because you're not technical today doesn't mean you can't learn those skills. I think technical skills can be picked up over time. And I would say talk to your manager, let them know your goals, let them know what you want to learn and how you want to contribute, right? Don't let like, I'm not technical today, keep you from being technical tomorrow if that's something that you want to pursue. I think those technical contributions are super valuable. So your manager will probably be very happy to hear that you want to pursue an area like that. And so I would say, go for it. Have a moment of maybe if this is something that really does feel to you like it's causing insecurity, like have that moment of vulnerability with your manager, tell them where you want to go, and maybe a little bit about your concerns as well. As a manager, that helps me, right? I look for opportunities for my folks. I try to make sure that they are able to achieve their career goals because that's important to me. So I would hope that your manager is the same or has similar goals as well. So yeah, definitely, I would say pursue that and pursue it openly. It can be a little bit hard, I think, especially if you've got to like fail more publicly than you want to. But I also think that those are learning experiences that actually pushes your seniority and your ability to continue contributing in bigger ways over time.
That's all the time we had for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you again to our amazing panelists. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.